morning, everyone. Welcome again to Cornerstone Church. My name is Zach, and right now we're going to take a look at the upcoming events we have going on here at Cornerstone. If you gave at all during the year 2017, we have a giving statement for you. You can pick up your giving statement at the table in the foyer immediately after service. Our church will be having a progressive dinner on Saturday, February 3rd, starting at 5 p.m. The night will consist of a 5-course meal, with each course served at a different home. If you'd like to attend a progressive dinner, please mark so on your connection card, and if you're open for your home being a host home for one of the meal courses, please mark that on the connection card as well. Childcare will be provided here at the church by our teenagers, with all proceeds going to Speed the Light. Our Sunday evening routine for the month of February is going to be a little bit different than normal. We encourage all of our life groups to meet on that first Sunday, February 4th, and then our monthly prayer meeting will be that following Sunday, February 11th, starting at 6 p.m. And just a reminder, our preschool and nursery volunteer luncheon will be today immediately following the service. Those are your announcements for this week. You can find out more about all these events and more on our website, bethaltochurch.com.
Eric, I'm the pastor here, and I just want to welcome you. I'm excited about what God is doing in us and through us. You know, neighboring, we've been talking about this over the course of the last several weeks here, but neighboring can be a challenge, can't it? I mean, my wife and I have lived in a variety of different homes over the years, and we have had some good neighbors, we have had some great neighbors, but we've also had some neighbors that are a little bit more on the challenging side of things, if you know what I'm talking about. Early on in our marriage, my wife and I lived in an apartment for just a few months. We had just started at a church in the Chicagoland area. We had to live in an apartment just temporarily as we're trying to figure out where we were going to land. And my wife walked out one day. I think I was at camp, and I wasn't even home. My wife walked outside into the parking lot where some of our neighbors in that apartment complex were having an argument that led into a physical altercation between a man and a female. We think it might have been his girlfriend. So those kind of neighbor stories are wonderful, right? We lived in a condo after that, and the walls of the condo were very, very thin, and we could often and regularly hear our neighbors right next to us arguing really, really poorly, like really bad. It was like you know, like there's arguing and then there's arguing. Yeah, they had the second there. It was uncomfortable because you'd see them outside and you're like, hey, how you doing? You're like, I know you're not doing so well because I know what she said to you. We had, early on in ministry, we were youth pastors and we lived in a parsonage, and the students in our youth ministry thought it would be great. Don't do this to your youth pastor. They thought it would be funny to shoot fireworks at and around our house all throughout the hours of the day and night one summer, and I finally figured out who it was, and then it stopped. Another house, we had a guy who we were a little suspicious he might be selling drugs. Either that or he had a lot of friends that would come over for 5 minutes at a time. I'm not sure. Kind of on and off, just constantly. Also in that neighborhood, we had another guy. He knew we were pastors, but he tried to get us to participate in insurance fraud. He had, it was in Chicagoland area, and hey, I know a guy. And he had this guy that he knew who would come over and look at your siding, and oh yeah, you got hail damage. And then he would put a claim in for your insurance, and you get new siding. And he thought it was great, and like all of my neighbors were getting new siding, but I could not remember ever having hail at any time. I'm surprised the insurance company didn't check that. And then of course we had the neighbor who just liked to look into our living room window. That was awkward. Oh hey, we're home, just in case you were worried. All right. Neighboring can be a challenge, right? It can be difficult at times. And you think I'm not making that up. We had some strange neighbors. You probably have stories. You might have neighbors like that. Hopefully you have a little bit nicer neighbors than that. But what do you do when your neighbors are challenging? I mean, what happens when, they're not like you, or you don't like them? Or what if they smell or have obnoxious kids? Or what if, or their kids are troublemakers? Today we're going to look at some of the challenges of neighboring, but as hard as those challenges are, those really aren't the kinds of challenges that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about challenges that are broader and more deeper than that, because sometimes the challenge that we have to the art of neighboring, it comes from within. It comes from how we perceive ourselves and what we have to offer to others. Sometimes there are challenges in our interactions with our neighbors, but some of the greatest challenges that we face are challenges that we face from outside our relationship with our neighbors, other people, and how they might criticize or get involved in the way we neighbor. Our text today comes from Luke chapter 5, and in this passage, Jesus is addressing a man named Levi. He calls him to be his disciple, and then Levi has a reaction where Levi's immediate reaction is to be a neighbor. And so the text today is going to reveal to us several different challenges that we face in neighboring. And the first challenge is the challenge of calling. Chapter 5 of Luke, verses 27 and 28 says this. After this, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector by the name of Levi sitting at his tax booth. "Follow me," Jesus said to him. And Levi got up, left everything, and followed him. So the first week of this series, we talked about the parable or the story of the Good Samaritan. And in that story that Jesus told, we saw that a Samaritan man saw a guy that was beat up and left for dead on the side of the road. So the Samaritan goes to him, he sees his need, and then he serves him. And I don't think it is a coincidence that Jesus essentially does the same thing here to Levi. He goes to Levi, he sees his need, and he calls him to be his disciple. I want to serve you and tell you about God's kingdom. This is a pretty significant action that Jesus takes, because Levi was a tax collector. And tax collectors, in this case, Levi was a Jewish man that was working for the Roman government to collect taxes from his own people, the Jewish people. And because of this, the Jewish people despised tax collectors because they were like rebels. They were people who took the enemy's side. They were extortionists. They thought that they were abusing their power, and for the most part, the tax collectors did do that. But Jesus, however, doesn't just see Levi's profession. Instead, he looks at him more deeply. In fact, the word that is translated sees, there's a Greek word talking about how Jesus saw Levi. It's not the normal word that you would use when talking about noticing someone in a crowd. It's a word that means to look with purpose or with intent. And so Jesus is noticing and looking, and he's directing his gaze at Levi, and he's not just seeing him from a surface, but he's kind of like looking into him and seeing the potential in Levi's life. So Levi's response then is pretty significant as well. We're told that Levi got up, he left everything in order to follow Jesus. Now, this is a standard description of what took place when disciples heard the call of Jesus and they followed him. At the beginning of this chapter, in chapter 5, you can read about Peter, James, and John. They're fishermen. And in a similar way, Jesus goes to them and he says, "I want you to be my disciples." And they drop their nets, they leave their boats, and they follow after Jesus. Now, fishermen were not particularly wealthy. They weren't known for having a lot of wealth or resources. And so for them to drop their nets in their boats, it was a sacrifice, but it was a skill, and they could always go back to that. But for Levi, him leaving what he was doing was quite a bit more significant, because Levi was, by in all that we know about tax collectors in those days, Levi was probably considerably wealthy. And for him to walk away from a cushy job with the Roman Empire, if this whole thing with Jesus ever fell apart, and if he were to go back, there would be no re-entry that would be possible for Levi to join this group of tax collectors again. I mean, you left us, you're out of the picture, buddy. We're not going to allow you back in. So this is a great act of sacrifice that Levi is taking and following after Jesus. And here's the key for us to understand the challenge within. It's this: Levi didn't allow his past sin to determine his response to his present calling. Levi didn't allow his past circumstances to determine his response to what Jesus said to him right there in that moment. The challenge within has to do with how we view ourselves, how we view our past, how we view our ability to fulfill God's call on our life. And if we're going to be good neighbors, we need to respond to Jesus' call like Levi did, with total commitment and total abandonment. And we can put it this way: Jesus' love for us, or rather this way, Jesus does not love us because of our worth. It's his love that gives us our worth. And I think sometimes we look at our past and we say, I'm not worthy. We look at maybe even our present situation and we say, I'm not worthy. I've not done enough good things. I've made too many mistakes. But it's not our abilities or that doesn't determine our worth. Christ determines our worth by loving us. He's the one that came to us. Remember, we talked about in the first week. He is the best neighbor. Just like the Samaritan went and saw and served, Jesus did that for us. He came to us, he saw our need, and he served us by dying on the cross on our behalf. Church, don't allow your past failures to paralyze you from accomplishing God's present calling to love your neighbor. I speak to people all the time and they feel like they're inadequate or they're unable or I have to learn more or I have to go through some sort of hoop spiritually before God can possibly use me. No, the call for all of us is the same. Love God and love others. Love God and love your neighbor. Go and do it. It's not about what you've done in the past. It's about what you do now in the present. Don't allow your past failures to paralyze you. One of the things I love about Levi is that he not only agrees to follow Jesus, but his first response after this is to be a good neighbor. Let's look at what he does in verse 29. This leads us to the challenge of invitation. It says this: Then Levi held a great banquet for Jesus at his house, and a large crowd of tax collectors and others were eating with them. Levi has such a profound encounter with Jesus. Jesus accepted him, even though he was a tax collector. He can't even contain it. So what does he do? He invites all his friends, all of his associates, all these other tax collectors to a big party. Now, he left everything, and part of leaving everything is using his wealth to throw a big party so that his friends or his neighbors can meet Jesus. This is the key here. Levi created an environment where his neighbors or his friends or his associates could meet with Jesus. The challenge for us in neighboring is finding ways where we can create an environment where our neighbors can meet Jesus. This can happen in a variety of ways. We can do this through prayer. We can do this through sharing our lives with them. But one of the most obvious ways that we can do this is by simply inviting our friends to church, inviting our neighbors to be a part of what God's doing here in our midst, here at Cornerstone. And so what I want to do is I want to show you just a 2 or 3 minute video of someone from our congregation who had the challenge of invitation, and that invitation wasn't even accepted readily, but kept on with it, and there's this beautiful story that's taken place. So I'm going to go ahead and let you guys show that video, and I'm really excited about this story. Check this out.
I couldn't imagine having better neighbors than the Goes.
Not at all. They moved out here about a month before we did, so going on 16 years. I actually call them Mom and Dad. Anytime something in our life happens, or they're always there for us, you know. I would go over and say, hey, this is happening, and her and Dennis would pray for us. Anytime something happened, you know, or they would just come in or going to church and say, hey, you guys want to go this week? You know, and they were very persistent.
Oh, I've invited them and told them about the fireworks and the Christmas. Just never clicked in their minds.
I just wasn't ready to start going back to church, and I would always give them just, you know, no, not this week, or maybe next week, you know. And then once we found out our daughter was a heroin addict,
we got custody of our 2 grandchildren, and it's been a really upheaval. Wouldn't you say?
So much. We knew we had to have somebody other than the Goaways to lean on, and we just decided that we were going to go.
So we decided to give it a try, and when you know it, the very first time we went was Royal Kids Camp, after the very first Royal Kids Camp.
Yeah, that was the very first time with the foster kids and everybody crying and giving their testimonies. It was an awesome service.
And of course their grandkids are fostered right now, so it really impacted them.
I cried through the whole thing because we could relate with everything them kids were going through.
I mean, it just felt like we were where we were supposed to be.
Right. We felt home. We felt like that was the church for us. I kind of drew to her because she was like going through a divorce and she was just struggling in life. And I told her, hey, why don't you guys come to church with us? And so after the second time I invited her, she decided to come, and she felt at home as well. That's what Cornerstone does to you. I know putting God in our life really helped us with our situation. So I knew if she put God in her life, it would help her go through what she's going through. If you know you have a neighbor that's struggling, and don't give up. Like Connie didn't give up on us. You know, they didn't give up on us. They just kept, any chance they got, they were going to church or just came from church, or we were struggling in our life, you know, with something that happened. Stay on it. Stay on them. Say, hey, come to church with me this week, or come to church with me next week. Don't give up on them.
Yeah.
So we've got the Goways who invite the Lileys, who end up inviting their neighbor. I mean, what will happen when you face the challenge of invitation and you say, I'm going to invite my neighbor? And what if they say no? I'm going to invite him again. I'm going to invite him. You know, Candy Liley in the video there, they showed up on the first day. We got back from our first camp, our Royal Family Kids Camp for foster care kids. She decided that day that she wanted to help us raise funds for camp. And so she made some necklaces and some bracelets and some other things. And she raised $1,200 to send 2 kids to camp. Now, and that's because the Goways faced the challenge of invitation and said, I'm going to invite my neighbors to encounter Jesus. And their way of doing that was to invite them here to church, which is, come on, that's an easy way to do that, right? It's a great way to do that. And so thank you to the Lileys for letting us do that, and the Goways. Now, the other neighbor, we may do a follow-up video, so I got to talk with her about that. But when we were developing this, that was kind of just developing, or we were creating the video, it was all kind of developing. So we'll see where that story leads. I'm excited to see the other neighbors that are going to be changed by this as well. That's the challenge of invitation. Challenge of invitation is to ask even when you don't know what the response is going to be. The invitation that's been given to each of us is to accept Christ as our Savior and Lord, and that invitation goes out to the entire world, and not everyone will accept it, but yet that invitation is still offered nonetheless. And we are called to be like that in that same way. I mean, when you think about what Jesus endured on the cross for the world, there are a lot of people who will not accept that invitation. And he served and he sacrificed on our behalf. So how are you serving? And how are you sacrificing? How are you facing the challenge of invitation to the people that are around you? And it might be, yes, inviting them to church, but it might just be inviting them into your life. Inviting them into having an opportunity to experience Jesus in you and through you. Now, the third challenge we find in the next verse here, in verse 30, Luke chapter 5, it's the challenge of criticism. This is a hard one for us. It says this, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law who belonged to their sect complained to his disciples, why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? See, Jesus was associating with people that the Pharisees didn't approve of. But what's more than that, Jesus and Levi, they were eating and drinking with these tax collectors. And in those days, it was one thing to have a meal and kind of be around somebody, but when you had a meal with someone in those days, it was a way of showing your approval of that person as like a brother or a sister. And so the religious elite in that day had a real problem with this. And I wish, church, that this was just an issue in Jesus' day, but I hear these kind of comments among believers today as well. Loving your neighbor, church, it might mean enduring criticism and scorn from people who profess a faith that they are unwilling to appropriately live out themselves. I don't know if you caught that, but I'll say it again. Loving your neighbor might mean enduring criticism and scorn from people who profess a faith that they are unwilling to appropriately live out themselves. The Pharisees, they wanted to be all about having a relationship with God through their works and their deeds, but the minute anybody did something outside of what they deemed acceptable, they criticized it. Being a neighbor might take you places that will make you uncomfortable. I mean, there were a lot of sinners at that party that day, and they were probably doing lots of sinnery things, right? They were doing sinnery. I just made that up. They were doing a lot of sinnery things at that party, right? They were. And the Pharisees criticized him. Jesus, throughout his ministry, goes to parties, and he's constantly being criticized for hanging around drunkards. Now, I'm not talking about being foolish, but your interactions with your neighbor may put you in situations that are a little bit uncomfortable or outside the norm of what you might expect or want. There were a lot of greedy, selfish, godless people at Levi's house that day. And there are some people that are Christians or church people who will avoid their neighbors because of how their neighbors live. They want to avoid their neighbor's sin. Oh, they smoke or drink in excess, and I don't want to be around that. Or they use bad language, or they watch inappropriate shows, or they're not married but they're living together, or whatever the issue is that you might have with them. But look, can I just be honest with you? If that's your mindset, how weak is your faith? How weak is your faith? Did you save yourself or did Christ save you? Is his salvation strong or is it just barely hanging on by a thread? Because if it's only hanging on by a thread, then what value does it have to share with the world around us? Is it strong or not? No, Christ's salvation is strong and sure and trustworthy and reliable. And we go out after experiencing that in the strength of his Spirit, in the strength of his power, and in the strength of his presence. Now, look, if you've got an issue with alcohol and you're prone to that, don't go to a bar, right? Don't go to a crazy party that has that. Be wise. Have wisdom. If you're prone to certain things, avoid those kinds of interactions and those environments. But church, let's not avoid our neighbors because they're sinners. We should know that, and we should be aware of that when we go there. And they're not going to be surprised if they know you're a Christian. They're going to know your morals and your lifestyle. That's not going to surprise them. But you know what might surprise them? Your God-motivated love and selfless sacrifice and the time that you give to them. The time that you give to them. Christianity is not best expressed by setting up barriers between us and heathens. True Christianity is about Jesus breaking down the barriers that separated us from him, coming into this world, living the life that we couldn't live, dying the death that we deserve so we could experience the freedom and the relationship with God that we didn't earn. And church, that's what we need to be about. So there's a challenge of criticism. Are you willing to endure the criticism of a Pharisee to be able to reach the person that God's called you to reach? I hope you are. I hope you are. And if you're one of those people who tends to be critical about the people around you, can I just encourage you to get in touch with God's grace and to realize that God has called us to go to those less than desirable places, the dirty sinners, or whatever you want to call them, the heathens. That's who we're called to go and love and to serve and to give to. Now, Jesus explains his actions in the next verse here, verses 31 through 32. He says, Jesus answered them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." That's kind of a scary thing. I don't know if Jesus is completely saying this, but when he says, "I've not come to call the righteous," look, there is no one righteous. I think Jesus might be saying those who are self-righteous. I think he's talking about the Pharisees who are like, "Oh, I'm righteous, I don't need you, Jesus," basically. Jesus, I'm not calling them. I'm calling those people who are aware of their need. I'm calling those people who are aware that they are sick and they are in need of healing. I mentioned that all throughout the Gospel of Luke, we find Jesus going to banquets and to parties. And these banquets are like a foreshadowing of the great banquet at the end of time that is to come, the great messianic banquet that we look forward to when all of God's people are gathered together to celebrate his victory over sin, death, and the grave. This is the picture we see in Revelation, chapter 7, verses 9 through 10. Listen to this, what it says. After this, John says, he's writing this, he has a vision. He says, "I looked, And there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands. And they cried out in a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb." Salvation belongs to God, not to us, not to our own abilities, not to our own works or our own worth or our ability to do all these good things and earn our way up to God. But salvation belongs to God. And if he can forgive you and he can forgive me, he can forgive the guy next door that's the sinner and the heathen and everything else. But you know what's amazing is God has chosen to use you and to use me by taking care of animals. By going over and being maybe a little uncomfortable when your neighbors have a lifestyle that's a little bit different than yours. And you invade their space and you love them selflessly. You don't even have to go in and be like, "You're wrong, you're bad, shouldn't do that." They're going to know where you stand because they know you're a believer, because as you interact with them, you're going to share your life with them. And it's not your job to get them to accept, but it's your job to go and to trust the Holy Spirit to do his part of the process. And in church, I feel like sometimes, so often in our lives, there's just this like gap that exists between us and our calling. And sometimes the challenge is within. "Oh, I don't think I can do this, God. I'm a tax collector in my past. I got issues and I got these things. I just got to, I got to go to church a little bit more regularly before I'm ready to do this. Or I got to read my Bible a little bit more." And sometimes it's a challenge within, and we got to get over that. Sometimes it's a challenge with others. I invited them and they said no, and it's awkward to ask them again. Or the challenge with others with invitation is I don't remember their names, and I got to get to know their names, and I've lived next to them for 20 years, and that's hard too. Sometimes the challenge is from others, and we're like, what are people going to think if I hang around this guy? He's having a party at his house, and I know they're going to be doing stuff that, this person over here and across the, the room is not going to approve of. And church, can we get over these things? And can we just develop the art of neighboring in our life and be the people that God's called us to be? Because I believe that there are other Lileys out there. And I believe that there are other families that need to experience God's grace and his forgiveness and his healing, just like you have. And so, church, let's be like Levi. Let's face these challenges squarely, and let's make a difference in the people that we find right next door to us. So how do we respond? First, if you're not a believer here today, I want to just encourage you and remind you and let you know that Jesus is the best neighbor there ever was. A few weeks ago, we talked about the parable of the Samaritan, or the story of the Good Samaritan. And we saw how that Samaritan went to the man in need. He saw his need, and he served him. That's what Jesus did for us. He came to us on this earth. He saw our need, and he served our greatest need, which was sin. All of us have sinned. All of us have separated ourselves from God. All of us have broken God's image in us by our selfish actions against him. But Jesus came, he saw our need, and he served our need by dying on the cross, offering us forgiveness. And today, if you're far from him today, if you don't have a relationship, I want to encourage you to find salvation in Jesus, the perfect neighbor who came to us, saw our need, and served us. Now again, we mentioned this the last couple of weeks. A general response for the rest of us today would be to go and invite your neighbors, right? That'd be a great one. But I'm going to even go back to what we've been talking about the last 2 weeks. This is the response I've given to our believers in the room, to fill out the block map. I don't think I have a picture of it in the notes. Do I, Jim? I do. Okay, good. Got a picture of the block map. We have papers of these that are located on the tables in the back and at the information booth. If you haven't been here the last 2 weeks, please get one of these. And some of you guys are like, this is like writing down names. This isn't very spiritual. I would say no. This is one of the most spiritual things I think that our church can do right now. It's one of the most practical things we can do. There's 3 blanks on here. One is the first one is A, and that's where you write your neighbors' names. It has 8 blanks there. Some of you aren't going to have 8 neighbors next to you, and you can work it out to your cul-de-sac or where you live. Write down the names of the people that are around you. You may not know their names. It might take you a few months until it gets warmer for you to be able to interact with them. I got one of my neighbor's names the other day. He actually caught me as I was going in the house, and I didn't see him. And so I've got one of my names, so I was able to fill out one of the blanks this week. We want to fill these names out. Second blank on there is information about them. The example I've been using is don't say that they like camping because you see a camper in their yard. Talk to them and find out where they like to camp, okay? You can, find something out through a conversation about them. And then the third one, the C, that is something this could take years to get to. So I'm saying we're not talking about quick fixes. We're talking about a long-term investment in our neighbors. The third one there is about us learning their passions, their dreams, their needs, how we can serve them. I believe that if our church, if you take this and you put this on your refrigerator and you see that, and you write their names down and you begin to pray for them, and you begin to engage them in conversation with purpose to get to know them and to find out their needs, I believe that we will experience transformation in the whole Riverbend area. What if the answer to the issues of our society are right next door to us because they need Christ and we can serve them? Church, I know this. I don't know where you think if this is spiritual or not. I think this is one of the most spiritual things we can do. So this year we're going to be encouraging you to continue to fill this out and spend time on this. Very straightforward today. There's challenges that we face within, with our neighbors, and then sometimes, unfortunately, with others outside. Let's be people that rise to the challenge to make a difference, that we develop the art of neighboring in our lives. Let's pray.